Welcome back to Secret Weapons. My name is Mark Johnston, and if this is your first time here, this is a YouTube channel where we do guitar, gear, demos, and reviews, as well as studio tips and tricks about leveling up your writing, playing, and production from a guitar player's perspective working out of a home studio. If that's the kind of thing that might appeal to you, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button and stick around for future videos. Today we're taking a look at the Layers by MXR. So as you might have picked up from that intro song as well as the name itself, Layers is a device that kind of grabs your signal passing into it and freezes pieces of it in place to create layers of frozen audio, beds of audio you can play over. And then there are a variety of ways to modify that audio. It's really interesting. It's basically a freeze pedal on steroids, which in turn are also on steroids. So let me explain. If you saw my demo at the start of this year on the MXR Joshua delay pedal, you will know that that delay was something that was a lot more than meets the eye. There was a ton of stuff under the hood with that device that let you get really granular with making changes to the delay that really made it one of the most robust delay pedals in this form factor I've ever seen. And that same ethos, that same ability to pack a ton into one of these little digital devices from MXR is continued with Layers. So let's talk about that. At its core, you have mix, trigger sensitivity, attack, and decay with a sub-octave and a button called single. You have an input, an output, and a control port. And that's just the beginning of what's for sale here. Input can be mono or stereo over TRS by taking the back off of the device and flipping a little switch internally. The output can be TRS output, or you can use that control port as a secondary audio output for dual TS cables or a single TRS cable stereo out on the output by itself. Attack is going to be the onset of the frozen audio. Decay is going to be the release, basically how long the audio decays out for. Trigger, like I said, is going to be sensitivity, and there's a little LED right next to it to let you know whether or not it's seeing enough of your audio to grab a sample of it to sample into a layer. And in the middle, you have single and sub-octave. Single is going to be, basically this thing has 3 layers at any given time that it's grabbing: center channel, right channel, left channel. And single will basically set it so that those layers either are allowed to overlap and decay beyond one another until you've circled all the way back around to replace the audio in that layer again, or in single mode where it kills the audio each time you step into the next layer. Something that can be very handy when using this for lower frequencies that can get muddy with overlapping notes, or if you're using this in a mono environment, the ability to kind of like have it just follow your playing more closely for a less ambient, a less washy, and a more tactile experience. Sub-octave is exactly what it sounds like. It takes the audio from the layer you are in and pitches it down an octave asterisk, because this is the point where we start getting into the customization of this device. At its core, it sounds pretty straightforward. It grabs audio and it freezes it in place. It's like any one of a dozen freeze pedals you've ever used, except in stereo, and with 3 freezes and an envelope to grab them for you instead of doing it manually, which you can also do. But this thing goes way further than that. By pressing and holding single or pressing and holding sub-octave, each of these knobs becomes the controller for a secondary or a third parameter each. This thing will allow you to take those layers and apply modulation to them, both in terms of the intensity of the modulation and the modulation mix for it, which will not only create movement on those frozen samples of audio, but it also will allow it to move across the stereo field, going from these center, right, left frozen positions, and instead go to a thing where each of those layers kind of drifts across the stereo field independently of one another, creating a much wider and more kind of fluid sounding environments. You also have a kill dry available to you as a subparameter for mix, which basically lets this become just its own perfectly quiet, like perfectly clean pad generator with no dry signal playing through it. Excellent for big ambient moments, or excellent for wet, dry, wet rigs if you want to use this in a second or a second and third amp environments. You also have a brilliant choice in this thing, which is a root note suboctave control under the attack knob, which basically tells this thing whether to pitch the entire sampled audio down that octave when suboctave is engaged, or to only grab like the lowest frequencies of what it has sampled from you. So basically, if you're playing a chord, instead of that whole chord being pitched down and risking sounding somewhat jumbled, you can play that chord and it will try its best to grab your root note, pitch that down, but leave the rest of that chord, the higher notes, kind of still being their kind of like airy, drifty selves in the original pitch, which is really, really intuitive and a really smart call on this device. The decay control likewise has submenu controls for mono or stereo operation, as well as the ability to kind of mix in some diffusion to those layers, adding a little bit of grit and texture. So like you can have modulation on those frozen layers to create a more like liquidy chorus or vibrato movement, or you can apply more of a diffused texture or some combination of the two, just to make them sound more at home in any mix you might be putting together. Not to like have too much in here or anything, but there's also a delay in here. So the single and sub-octave controls over the trigger will mix in the speed of a delay and the delay mix. So you can decide how much of a delay, stereo delay in this thing, in parallel with the frozen layers is mixed in. You can set the speed of that using that trigger control, or by holding single and tapping it in with sub-octave. And the decay for that delay is tied to the decay of the layers themselves. So for those of you keeping score at home right now, this one device can be an auto swell, a pad generator that can almost be reverberant. It can be a stereo modulator, a stereo delay, and a sub-octave kind of pad generator. It's this big. Why is it this big, and why does it do so many things? Like the Joshua is also this big and also did a lot, but everything it did was delay with a little bit of reverb mixed in too. This thing does so many things in such a small enclosure. I wish that all of the submenu controls were labeled on devices like this, because I basically live with the manual open on my computer while I'm working with it, just to like remind myself of where everything goes. And speaking of nitpicky, I use this on bass on that intro track, and I would say that one of the only actual gripes I have with this is it can seem a little bit finicky about grabbing bass notes. It works very, very well with guitar, and it works really well on the upper half of my bass, but I can feel sometimes like it just doesn't want to grab onto some of the low bass notes and everything. So just be aware of that. If you saw that bass portion of the video and went, I'm a bass player, this is a great fit for me, it might not be the best. It's a your mileage may vary situation on that front. I wouldn't necessarily say this is great on bass, except for very niche use cases, but it does kill it on guitar. MXR has been really engineering the ever-loving hell out of these devices recently. This is potent, it sounds cool. About the only thing it's missing is high and low pass EQ. And to be fair, I would love for this to have had some additional EQ controls in it. I realize we're asking for a lot at this point, but like I would have taken that over maybe diffusion or something, just because sometimes those low frequency buildups can get a bit much. And I don't necessarily want to carve low frequencies out of my dry guitar, but it would be nice to be able to carve them out of some of those pads. But we are getting nitpicky for a device this size with this capacity. So yeah, this is Layers. It's really impressive. Let's get to our sound samples. As always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we are working in. I am playing my Music Man St. Vincent Goldie into the 29 Pedals EUNA, the Origin FX Cali 76 compressor, the Greer amps Lightspeed overdrive, and the Benson Germanium Boost. From there we go to the MXR Layers, mono in and stereo out to the Joshua Ambient Echo, in stereo out to the Strymon Bigsky MX. We then go to our amplifier, which is the Milkman The Amp Stereo, and then to our DAW, which is Universal Audio's Luna, running a Neve 1073 for our kind of preamp gain. Here is our dry tone. So let's start by looking at kind of like the most basic setup here. We're not going to get into the submenu stuff until we kind of like exhaust everything on the face. But at its core, everything at noon, this is just a very simple way of kind of like dynamically grabbing pads. So all you have to do is turn the pedal on. And by the way, double tap to turn it back off again, because once it's on, the foot switch just steps through the 3 different voices. So let's clear it, turn it back on. We're starting with that middle voice. So the basic control scheme here is you have your mix control, which is how loud those layers come in. Your trigger, which is how much sensitivity the pedal has to your input signal to kind of like take cues to grab onto audio to make stretch layers out of. And then you have attack and decay, which is going to be the onset and the release of any of those given pads. So let's start by taking a look at that trigger. So down at the very bottom here, you have off, which you basically use in that context. You have to kind of grab on with a sustain pedal or manually trigger, like to grab audio. And then as you move it above there, it gets progressively more sensitive. And that sensitivity, that trigger control is useful for kind of avoiding passing notes getting picked up and kind of string noise creating its own layers. Because if you've got it really high like that, you can get a little bit of kind of hear those wind noises from just like messing with strings. Whereas if you bring it down a little bit, you're not going to get that stuff triggering, but you will still be able to kind of with a little bit more consistency. Taking a look at our attack knob, this is the onset of the layers. So at it's described as basically square to ramp up, but obviously that kind of like the back half of that is going to depend a lot on the way that this decay is set. So let's set a reasonably long decay and go to that square attack. All the way through long, gently crescendoing. And then you have how long it takes for that audio to fade back out with decay. Versus infinite. And obviously that will kind of overwrite as you like travel back around to each of those 3 voices. But you do end up in positions where you kind of have it hold on for forever or kind of gently fade really slowly. bringing in our compressor. You also have access to the ability to not allow any of these to overlap with one another. Instead, each time you step between your voices, it ends the one before it. On that intro track, I used single mode for those bass parts to avoid too much kind of like low frequency buildup. And speaking of low frequency buildup, you also have a sub-octave control, basically blending in an octave down with that pad. Worth noting that that sub-octave does not affect active pads, but only ones coming in later, so you can make adjustments like that without kind of like messing with whatever you're working on currently, which can be handy for like live performance like moments with this kind of device. Okay, so that's the 4 knobs and the 2 buttons and the foot switch. The ability to walk through voices, the ability to double tap to bypass, and the ability to kind of fine tune the way that this thing grabs onto your audio and makes layers of kind of audio stretched pad with it. But that would be all well and good as kind of an early in chain that you then have to run through a variety of other devices to get something cool out of it. But much like with the Joshua, this thing has a surprising amount of sub-feature, sub-menu control stuff to kind of fine-tune and adjust layers as you want. So let's get into all of the kind of additional parameters. Each of these knobs can basically be 3 different parameters. For example, mix is mix on its own, but then with pressing and holding single or pressing and holding sub-octave, you can use the mix to adjust other parameters as well. So let's walk through those. For mix, sub-octave is going to allow you to turn on wet-only mode. So we've got our dry signal, or a kill dry. As well as the ability to blend in some modulation. And so that is amount of modulation. There is the ability to control the modulation mix, which is basically going to be the attack knob. So that attack knob is also twofold. The single is going to be the amount of modulation mixed into your signal, and the sub-octave is going to be the ability to engage basically root note sub-octave, which basically moves the device from selecting all of the audio from your current layer and creating that sub-octave out of it, or grabbing onto just the lowest frequencies in it to create a slightly cleaner version of sub-octave. So let's go ahead and take our modulation back out for a second. Let's go back to kill dry, engage that sub-octave. So in this mode, we will get the entire chord is octaving down, or north of noon, it attempts to grab only the low frequencies. So as you can hear those same chords, it's grabbing the lowest note, creating a sub-octave from that, but allowing the rest of the chord to play out. So here's like, a good old-fashioned G major cowboy chord. You're still hearing the right frequencies and the right octaves for most of that chord, but you're getting that low G octave down. Which I like. Let's take that sub-octave back out, bringing back in some of that modulation, and also bring in some modulation into the blend. And now you have... So now, instead of getting hard panned modulation, or hard pan layers, great subtle modulation, but a lot of blend in the modulation. And that allows you to get to a place of auto-panning those layers around. Let's bring our dry back in. So additional movement in the device, which is really cool. Not to be over-designed or anything, but this thing also has a delay. Sub-octave and single on trigger will allow you to mix in the time and the dry guitar send to the delay. So the delay is in parallel with the layers themselves, which basically means that if you're in kill dry and you play like notes, even if this is fading in, you'll still hear the delay come in as if it was being hit by the dry guitar. But let's give it a listen. So let's bring in our delay mix and set our delay time. And the delay feedback is tied to the decay control. On this decay control, you also have access to the ability to sum the pedal to mono. So you can hear it's all coming out of the left channel right now because I'm running a TRS stereo output to stereo inputs on the next one, but that is how you disengage stereo outputs. Stereo inputs are adjusted using an internal dip switch that you have to flip, and then the decay knob's other secondary control on single is going to be the inclusion of basically diffusion on the layers. So we've got, let's go back to kill dry. its sweet spots. It does a great job of keeping things feeling organic by adding a little bit more texture that feels less like a, granular sampler, that kind of thing. Those are all of the submenu controls, so let's just take a second and let's dial in something beautiful and ambient without having to use any other devices. A little bit of delay. Let's go with our longest delay time. We've got that little bit of modulation, or that little bit of diffusion already dialed in. Let's go ahead and bring in our modulation mix with not too much modulation depth or anything. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Yeah, I would love to know what you think of this thing. That is a feature-rich, very small device. Are you into this kind of thing? Is this the kind of like version of looping or layering or texture that you would use in your writing? And if not, what do you use to kind of accomplish those same goals? I would love to hear from you. And until next time, thanks for watching.